The morning Inez Hadley finally flung open the front door of her homestead, she was not prepared for what she found waiting on the porch step. She had armed herself with a cast-iron skillet, her jaw set hard as flint, her dark eyes blazing with a fury that had been building for 31 mornings straight. 31 mornings of finding, a covered tin plate left there like a ghost had passed through her land in the dead of night and deposited proof that someone was watching her. Someone was close. Someone knew she woke before dawn and ate alone in silence and went to bed with an empty stomach more nights than not. That kind of knowing was not comfort. That kind of knowing was a threat, and Inez Hadley had survived too many threats to pretend otherwise. She had come to this patch of dry Colorado earth in 1883 with nothing but a deed, a mule, and a grief so vast it had hollowed her out like a canyon. She had not come here to be watched. She had not come here to be seen. And yet someone had seen her. Someone had decided without her permission, without so much as a knock or a word or a single introduction, that she needed feeding. The skillet was raised. Her breathing was controlled. She yanked the door back with enough force to rattle the frame, and she stepped onto the porch ready to unleash every ounce of the anger and the fear and the raw, desperate loneliness that she had been converting into rage for the better part of a month. And there he was, not running, not startled, not slinking away into the gray-blue light of the early Colorado morning like someone caught in a betrayal. He was crouched down on one knee on her bottom porch step, setting a tin plate covered with a square of cheesecloth onto the worn wood, moving with such careful, deliberate slowness that he looked almost reverent, like a man placing something fragile on an altar. He looked up at her the instant she burst through the door, and he did not flinch. He did not reach for the gun on his hip. He simply went still, holding that covered plate in both hands, his pale gray eyes finding hers in the early morning half-dark, and he held her gaze with the steady calm of a man who had already decided how this moment would go and had made peace with every possible outcome. He was lean and trail-worn, dressed in a long, dust-colored coat with a hat pushed back on his head, and there was a quality to his stillness that Inez had never encountered before in another human being. He was not performing calm. He simply was calm down to his bones in a way that made her own thundering heart feel loud and reckless by comparison. "You," she said, and her voice came out harder than she intended because the hard edge was the only thing holding the trembling underneath it in place. "Morning," he said, quiet, just the one word. The skillet was still raised. He looked at it. He looked back at her face. He did not move. "Who are you?" she demanded. "And why have you been leaving food on my porch every single morning for over a month without once having the decency to introduce yourself?" He set the plate down gently on the step. He rose to his full height, which was considerable, and he tucked his thumbs into his belt and he gave her question the silence it apparently deserved before he answered it. "Name's Milton Doyle," he said, "and I left the food because you needed it." 3 words. You needed it. Said with no pity in them, no performance of charity, no hidden motive she could immediately identify, which made them more dangerous than any of those things would have been. Inez Hadley had learned long ago that the most treacherous traps were the ones that did not look like traps at all. She lowered the skillet exactly 2 inches, not all the way, just enough to let him know she was listening. "That is not an answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." And that was how it began. To understand why Inez Hadley had come to the high, dry country of southwestern Colorado Territory alone in the autumn of 1883, you had to understand what she had left behind in Missouri and what had been taken from her, and what the difference was between leaving and being driven out, because those things were not the same, and she would not allow anyone to confuse them. She had been married at 22 to a man named Robert Hadley, who had been handsome and ambitious in the way that certain men are handsome and ambitious before life shows them who they actually are underneath those qualities. Robert had come from good Missouri farming stock, and he had talked about the West with the gleaming eyes of a man in love with an idea, and Inez, who had been in love with him at the time and had not yet learned to distinguish between a man and his ideas, had listened to him with her heart open wide. They had married in the spring of 1879. She had been 22. He had been 26. They had 2 years of something that resembled happiness, the ordinary textured happiness of building a life together from scratch, before Robert's dark past began to resurface in ways she had not anticipated and had not been warned about. It was not dramatic at first. It was slow, the way erosion is slow, and by the time you notice the damage, the ground has already shifted beneath you. Robert had debts he had not disclosed. He had alliances with men of questionable character. He had a temper that emerged only under specific pressures, and then retreated again so completely that Inez would doubt what she had seen. He was not, in the end, a bad man exactly, but he was a weak one, and the frontier had a way of exposing weakness with a thoroughness that could be brutal. Robert Hadley died in the winter of 1882 during a business arrangement gone catastrophically wrong. An arrangement involving cattle that did not belong to him and men who did not forgive. The manner of his dying was ugly and fast, and left Inez with a deed to 40 acres of Colorado land that Robert had purchased with money she had not known about, and a reputation in their Missouri community that made staying there feel like a slow suffocation. She did not grieve Robert the way a widow was supposed to grieve. She grieved him the way you grieve something that was never quite what it appeared to be, with a complicated sorrow that had anger braided through it, and a secret relief she was ashamed to feel. She packed what she could carry, sold what she could sell, and she went west to the 40 acres and the small stone and timber homestead that stood on them, and she had been there alone for almost a year when the mornings began to change. The first morning she found the plate, she thought she had left it there herself in some half-asleep fog, which told her something about how exhausted she had let herself become. It was a tin plate with 2 biscuits and a strip of salt-cured bacon still faintly warm, and a small cloth-wrapped portion of dried apple, and she had stood on her porch in the gray morning cold looking at it for a long time before she picked it up and carried it inside and ate it because she was hungry. The second morning there was cornmeal porridge with a little molasses worked through it, and the warmth of it in her hands on that sharp October morning made something in her chest ache in a way she did not want to examine. By the 5th morning she was standing at her window before dawn trying to catch sight of whoever was doing this, and she saw nothing. Nothing but the empty land and the scrub oak turning rust and gold and the flat pale sky. By the 10th morning she was angry. By the 20th morning she was frightened in a way she could not entirely explain, because whoever was doing this had access to her land, had knowledge of her habits, had the skill to come and go without being detected, and Inez Hadley did not scare easily, but she was not foolish enough to confuse bravery with the absence of good judgment. By the 31st morning she had made her decision, and she had gotten the skillet, and she had waited by the door until she heard the faintest creak of the bottom porch step, and she had thrown the door open and found Milton Doyle. He came back that same evening. She was at the small table in her kitchen working through an account ledger that never quite balanced no matter how many times she ran the numbers, and she heard the knock at the door, and her hand went immediately to the rifle she had leaned against the wall after the morning's confrontation. Then she heard his voice. "Miss Hadley," he said through the door, and it was the same quiet voice from the morning, no urgency in it, no pressure. "I would like to explain myself if you are willing to hear it. I will go away again if you are not." Inez set the rifle down. She crossed to the door and opened it without taking the chain off first, which meant she could see him but he could not enter. "You know my name," she said. "You are the only homesteader on this particular stretch," he said. "Not a difficult thing to learn. And yet you did not use it for 31 mornings." "No," he said. "I did not think you would want me to." That gave her pause. It was a strangely perceptive thing to say. She studied him through the narrow gap. In the lamplight spilling through the crack of the door he looked younger than she had initially thought, somewhere in his late 20s, she guessed, though there was a quality to his face that made age difficult to pin down, a weathered self-containment that could have belonged to any decade of a hard-traveling life. His jaw was clean-shaved, which surprised her. His gray eyes were patient. "Why are you here?" she said. Not the same question as this morning's "Who are you?" A different question entirely. He considered it with the same unhurried seriousness he had given everything else. "I came through this valley last year," he said, "on my way north. I saw the homestead and I saw that it was recently occupied by someone who was managing alone. I came back through in September because I had nowhere particular to be and this seemed like a place that might need something." He paused. "I camped on the ridge east of your property. I watched for a few days. Not in a dark way," he added, and the care he took to make that distinction registered with Inez more than she expected it to. "Just to understand the situation. You were working too hard and eating too little and doing both alone. I know what that looks like because I have done it myself, so I started leaving the food." Inez was quiet for a moment. She was sorting through what he had said for the hidden motive, the trap buried somewhere in the reasonable-sounding surface of it, the angle she was not yet seeing. "That is either the most selfless thing I have ever heard," she said slowly, "or the most elaborate setup for something I have not yet identified." The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, something more tentative than that. "I understand why it would seem that way," he said. "What do you want from this land?" "Nothing. From me." A silence, a longer one this time. "I am not sure that is the right question at this point," he said finally. Inez looked at him for a long moment. Then she unlatched the chain. She opened the door the rest of the way. "Come in," she said. "But you should know that the rifle is within my reach." "I would expect nothing less," Milton Doyle said, and he stepped inside. He sat at her kitchen table and she made coffee because she had decided that if she was going to interrogate a man she would do it properly, and she placed 2 tin cups between them and poured, and she sat across from him, and she looked at him directly and she said, "Start at the beginning." He did, and it took a while, and she refilled the coffee twice. And by the time he was done the lamp was burning low, and the night outside was deep and cold, and Inez had revised her assessment of Milton Doyle several times. "He was from Kansas originally," he said. "A farm family, 7 children of which he was the 4th. He had left home at 19, which was 1875, with a small amount of money and a larger amount of restlessness. And he had spent the years since then moving, working cattle drives, working as a hand on ranches from Kansas to New Mexico, taking occasional work as a scout because he had a talent for moving quietly through country and reading terrain. He had never stayed anywhere more than a season. He did not say why, she did not press it. He had no known enemies that he was aware of, he said, which was a careful sort of phrasing that she noticed. He had no family obligations he was avoiding. He was simply a man who had become accustomed to motion and had not yet found a reason sufficient to stop. "Until now," she said. He met her eyes across the table. "I am not making a claim," he said carefully. "I understand I have no right to make any claim. I am just trying to explain what brought me back to this particular valley." "Which was what, exactly?" He turned the tin cup slowly in both hands. "Something about this place felt unfinished," he said. "Like there was something here that needed attending to." He looked up. "I do not believe I am explaining this well." "No," she said, "but I appreciate that you are trying." There was a silence between them that was not entirely uncomfortable, which surprised Inez. She was not accustomed to silences with people being comfortable. Most people filled silence like it was a wound they were afraid to leave open. Milton Doyle wore silence the way he wore his coat, naturally, without effort, without apparent need to justify it. "There is something I need to tell you," he said then, and the slight shift in his voice made Inez's hand move imperceptibly closer to the rifle. "It is about why I left Kansas." She waited. "I had a friend," he said, "a man named Cal Ferris. We came up together, worked the same drives for 3 years. Good man, decent man." He paused. "He got into trouble with a rancher named Breck Aldis up in the Panhandle. Land dispute, or what Aldis called a land dispute, which really meant he wanted land that Cal had been working for 2 years, and he had the money and the hired guns to take it. Milton's jaw tightened, the first real display of feeling he had shown. I helped Cal fight it. We were not smart about it. We were angry and we were young and we were not smart. There was a confrontation. Nobody died, he added quickly, but Aldous had contacts with the territorial law in ways that meant the story came out wrong when it was written down. Cal had to leave the territory. I had to leave too because I had been named in the account. Inez studied him. That was the dark past you were waiting to disclose. I thought you deserved to know, he said. Before you decided what you wanted to do with my being here. That is a reasonable position, she said. There is a warrant, he said. Old one from 1877, Kansas Territory. I do not know if it is still active. I suspect it probably is. Inez absorbed this. A man with a warrant was a complication she did not need. She looked at him across the table and she thought about the 31 mornings, the careful warm food, the fact that he had never once in all that time used his proximity to her isolated land to take anything or threaten anything or even make himself known until she had forced the issue, and she thought about what that kind of sustained, invisible patience said about a person's character. "Where are you camping?" she said. "Ridge east of the property, about half a mile." "That is a cold camp in November in Colorado," she said. "I have managed." She stood and carried the cups to the wash basin. She stood at the basin with her back to him for a moment, thinking. "There is a small barn," she said. "The south side of it stays warmer than the north. There is no livestock in it currently because I have not yet been able to afford what I need. You may sleep there if you choose, as long as you understand that any appearance of your intentions changing from what you have described tonight will result in consequences." "I understand," he said. "I will not ask you to leave because of an old warrant," she said, "provided you are telling me the truth about the nature of it. But I will ask you to be honest with me going forward, because I have had enough of men's hidden secrets to last me several lifetimes." "That is a fair condition," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was standing now, hat in his hands, and there was something in the way he held himself that she found herself wanting to understand. A self-contained dignity that was different from arrogance and different from defeat, something that seemed to have come from a very long time spent entirely in his own company and making peace with that. "Do you have a horse?" she asked. "Yes, left him ground-tied on the ridge." "Bring him in. There is hay in the barn." He left, and Inez locked the door and went to her bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time, listening to the deep Colorado night, and asking herself whether she was being foolish or whether she was finally, for the first time in a very long while, trusting something that actually deserved to be trusted. She did not have an answer, but she noticed that for the first time in months, the silence of the house did not feel quite so much like a weight. November deepened into the cold it saved for the high country, and Milton Doyle stayed. He was useful, which was the first thing Inez acknowledged to herself, because it was the safest thing to acknowledge. He repaired the fence line on the north side of her property, which had been leaning badly since before she arrived. Using wood he cut himself from fallen timber on the ridge. He remortared 3 sections of the stone wall on the east side of the house, where the wind had been finding its way through. He did these things without being asked, and without drawing attention to them, which meant Inez would discover the work done and have to decide how to receive it. And after a few days of deciding to receive it with neutral acknowledgement, she began to receive it with something closer to gratitude. He cooked his own meals on a small camp stove in the barn, though sometimes there was extra food left in the covered tin that now appeared inside her kitchen door rather than on the porch step, because he had taken to coming into the kitchen at her invitation each morning, and there had been a gradual shift, so gradual she barely noticed it happening, from the covered tin on the porch to a warm plate on the kitchen table to, eventually, Milton Doyle standing at her wood stove cooking breakfast, while Inez sat at the table with the account ledger or a cup of coffee and they talked. They talk the way two people talk when they are being careful with each other, but are also genuinely curious about each other, with a kind of alert attentiveness on both sides. Inez learned that Milton had read more widely than his drifter's life suggested, that he had strong opinions about things he had seen and thought through, that he had a dry humor that surfaced rarely but was worth waiting for. Milton learned that Inez was sharper than her self-contained exterior suggested, that she had been formally educated at a women's school in St. Louis for 2 years before her family's finances made continuation impossible, that she had strong feelings about the land she was sitting on and a complex relationship to what it meant to have claimed it. "This was Ute territory," she said one morning in mid-November, looking out the kitchen window at the flat-lit landscape. "The Ute people were removed from most of this region just a few years ago, in 1881. Forced out after the Meeker incident, which was itself a complicated situation that got represented in the papers as simpler than it was." She paused. "I have thought about that a great deal. About whether sitting on a deed to 40 acres of Colorado territory makes me part of a pattern I find morally objectionable." Milton was quiet for a moment, which was not his discomfort with the subject but his habit of thinking before speaking. "What do you do with that thought?" he said. "I have not resolved it," she said. "I stay because I do not know where else to go and because leaving would not give the land back to anyone, but I carry the discomfort." She looked at him. "Do you think about it? The men you have worked for, the territories you have passed through?" "Yes," he said simply. "I think about what the land was before we named it and divided it and put prices on it. I think about it often." He poured coffee into both their cups. "I think the least a person can do is hold the discomfort honestly rather than explaining it away." Inez looked at him across the steam of the coffee. "You are a surprising man, Milton Doyle," she said. "I am a simple man," he said, "who has had a great deal of time to think." The first time he touched her was entirely accidental and entirely not. They were working together in the small kitchen garden that Inez was preparing for a winter covering of straw to protect what bulbs she had planted in the fall, and her hands were cold, and she had dropped the wooden-handled trowel twice already. And when she reached for it, the third time Milton's hand came down over hers to pick it up at the same moment, and they both went still. His hand was warm. She had not expected it to be warm, which was an absurd thing to notice, but she noticed it anyway, the solid warmth of his hand over the back of hers, and neither of them moved for a moment that stretched out longer than accidental contact required. He lifted his hand. He set the trowel in hers without a word. She bent back to the garden, but something had shifted in the air between them, something that had been building incrementally for weeks and had now announced itself, quietly, the way certain things announce themselves in the West, not with thunder but with a change in the quality of the light. That evening she was sitting by the small cast-iron stove in the front room when he knocked on the door of the house, which he always did despite the fact that she had told him he did not need to. And she said, "Come in," and he came in and sat in the other chair by the stove, the one that had gradually become his chair over the weeks without either of them formally designating it as such. And they sat together in comfortable silence for a while. "Tell me something about yourself that no one else knows," she said eventually, not because she planned to say it. It simply came out of the comfortable silence between them. He thought about it for a long time. "I used to want to be a teacher," he said finally. She looked at him. He was looking at the stove. "I had a teacher in Kansas," he said, "when I was 11 or 12, a man named Emory Bell. He had come out from Ohio and he taught in a one-room schoolhouse for 3 years before the lack of funding made it impossible to continue. He was the only person I ever met who made me feel like thinking about the world was a worthwhile way to spend time. I wanted to do what he did." "Make someone feel that way." He paused. "Then I left at 19 and the years went the direction they went and that particular idea got left behind." "It is not too late for it," Inez said. "It might be," he said. "Or it might not." He looked at her finally. "What about you? What about me? Something no one else knows." She considered the question seriously because he had. "I am not as devastated by Robert's death as I am supposed to be," she said, "and the fact that I am not is something I have carried as a secret shame for over a year because it seems to say something dark about my character." "It says nothing dark about your character," he said with a quiet certainty that landed with unexpected force. "It says you are honest." Inez looked at the orange glow of the stove. She felt the thing in her chest that she had been keeping carefully managed begin to loosen in a way that was not entirely comfortable but was also, she recognized dimly, a relief. "I have been afraid," she said, surprising herself again, "of the way this valley has started to feel like home, because every time something has felt like home it has stopped being one." Milton was quiet for a long moment. "I know that fear," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with those steady gray eyes, and there was something in them that she had not let herself name until now, something that was careful and restrained and genuine and frightened, all at once, and she recognized it because it was the same thing she had been feeling for weeks without permission. "Milton," she said. "Inez," he said, and the way he said her name was different from anyone who had ever said it before, like it meant something specific to him, like he had been holding it carefully. She leaned forward and set her hand on his arm, and he looked down at it, and then up at her, and they sat like that for a long moment in the firelight, not kissing, not moving, just acknowledging what was there between them with a seriousness that felt more intimate than either of those things. "I am not asking you to be anything other than what you are," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not asking that of you either." She pulled her hand back. They sat companionably by the stove for another hour. But something had been said, even without words, and they both knew it. December came, and the snow came with it, real snow, the kind that the high Colorado country specializes in, deep and dry and constant, and the valley went white and silent, and the homestead became an island in a landscape that seemed to extend in every direction without limit. This was the hardest time of year for a solo homesteader. Inez had known this going in and had prepared as well as she was able, which was reasonably well but not without gaps. Milton had been preparing too. She discovered, quietly and without announcement, the way he did everything. He had spent the weeks of November supplementing her wood supply, cutting and splitting timber, and stacking it against the south wall of the barn, and then, as November progressed, against the south wall of the house as well. He had done 2 trips to the small town of Montrose, 18 miles north, for supplies, returning with things she needed that she had not mentioned needing, which meant he had been paying close attention to the inventory of the kitchen and the storage room. The first time she understood the full extent of this, she stood in the storage room doorway looking at the organized shelves and felt something close to overwhelming gratitude and something else underneath it that she was not yet ready to name. She went to the barn. He was there, checking on the horse, a solid dark bay he called Jasper, and he turned when she came in and saw her face and went still. "You did not have to do all of this," she said. "I know," he said. "You have spent your own money on my household." "Some," he said, "not so much." "Milton." He turned back to the horse for a moment, running a hand along the animal's neck. "You have given me shelter," he said. "You have given me a place to be. You have talked to me like I am a person worth talking to. The supplies seem like a small balance against all of that." Inez crossed the barn and stood beside him, and she looked at the side of his face and she thought about everything she had come to know about him in these 2 months. The patience of him, the honesty, the way his hands moved when he worked, the quality of his silences, the carefully restrained warmth that he kept so close to his chest, but that leaked through anyway in small, constant ways. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was falling in love with this man, and that she was not going to pretend otherwise anymore. "Look at me," she said. He looked at her. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, her cold fingers against his jaw, and she watched his eyes go very still and very serious. "I have been frightened of this," she said, "but I think I am going to stop being frightened now." "Inez," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual. "Is this something you want?" She asked him, direct and clear, because she was not a woman who left important questions unanswered. "Yes," he said. Just the one word, but with everything behind it. She kissed him then, standing in the cold barn with the December snow pressing against the walls and the horse shifting softly in his stall, and he kissed her back with the same contained but absolute intensity with which he did everything, his hands coming up carefully to hold her face like she was something he could not believe was real. They stood there in the cold barn for a long time. Christmas in 1883 in the Hadley homestead, which would gradually and informally become known to Inez in her own mind as something less lonely than that name implied, was a modest affair. There was not money for extravagance, and neither of them were people who required extravagance, but there was something about the holiday that called for acknowledgement even in the high, empty country of Colorado. Inez had a small pine bough arrangement on the kitchen table. She made a proper meal, the best she could manage with what the storage room offered, a roasted joint of meat that Milton had secured in Montrose along with a sweet potato preparation and biscuits, and a small dried fruit cake that took 2 days to assemble but was worth it. Milton gave her a book. He had written to Montrose specifically for it, she later understood, a collection of essays by a writer she had mentioned admiring in passing 3 weeks earlier. She had mentioned it once in the middle of a longer conversation, and she had not expected him to have been listening for it. The fact that he had been listening for it, that he had stored that small specific detail of her and acted on it, moved her more than she could easily articulate. She gave him a set of leather-covered journals she had found in the storage room among Robert's old effects, never used, and she had thought of Milton wanting to be a teacher, and the way that ambition had a quality of thinking things through carefully for later use, and she thought that a man who thought carefully deserved a place to put his thoughts. He held the journals and looked at them and then looked at her with an expression that she was coming to recognize as his version of being overwhelmed, the very slight brightness at the edge of his eyes, the deliberate settling of his breath. "You have been listening too," he said. "Yes," she said, "I have." They spent the evening by the stove and talked about their lives before the valley, the good parts and the hard parts and the parts that were both at once, and it was the most openly Inez had spoken about herself since before Robert's death, maybe since before the marriage, and it felt not like exposure but like relief. January was brutal. The temperature dropped to levels that the thermometer Inez had nailed to the porch post could barely register, and the snow came in waves, one after another with barely 3 days between them, and there were nights when the wind screamed across the ridge and found every gap in the stone house, and Milton moved his bedroll from the barn into the front room of the house, and neither of them pretended this was only about the cold, and neither of them said it was anything other than what it was. He slept by the stove. She slept in her bedroom, but they were under the same roof, and she would lie awake in her room and listen to the wind, and know he was there on the other side of the wall, and find that the wind no longer sounded quite the same as it had when she had been utterly alone in it. They talked every morning over the breakfast Milton made, which had become simply a fact of her days, something she no longer questioned or felt conflicted about. The sound of him moving in her kitchen before she was properly awake, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and whatever he was cooking. She had tried once in early January to preempt him and make breakfast herself to see what he would do, and he had come into the kitchen and found her at the stove, and had stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression that was careful, and then had simply said, "Can I help?" And she had said yes, and they had made breakfast together, which turned out to be better than either of them making it alone. In late January, a man came to the homestead. He appeared on a horse at the edge of the property line one gray afternoon when Milton was working on the fence and Inez was inside, and Milton saw him before Inez did, and he watched the man for a moment with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to read strangers at a distance. Then he walked toward the house without hurrying, but without stopping. He came in through the back door and found Inez at the table, and he said, "There is a man on the east boundary. I do not know him, but he is watching the property." Inez went to the window. She could see the horse and rider, a man in a dark coat, too far to make out a face. Could be the man from Aldous. Because she had been thinking about the warrant since November, thinking about what it meant for the both of them. Possibly, Milton said. His jaw was set but his eyes were calm. Or it could be nothing, a traveler reading the land. Or it could be trouble coming. Yes, he said, it could be. What do you want to do? He thought about it. I want to go speak to him, he said. I would rather meet trouble facing than let it sit on my boundary. Our boundary, Inez said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Our boundary, he said. He went out and she watched from the window, one hand on the rifle, as Milton walked across the white field toward the east fence line, and she watched the man on the horse watch him come, and after a long moment the man turned his horse and rode north and did not come back. Milton came inside and stamped the snow from his boots and said, "He is gone." Who was he? I do not know. He did not say anything. He looked at me and rode away. Inez thought about this. That is not comfort, she said. No, Milton agreed. It is not. They did not speak of it that evening, but both of them were listening to the night a little differently. And in the morning, Milton rode to Montrose and made inquiries, carefully, at the post and at the saloon where information tended to collect, and he came back in the evening with news that was not what Inez had feared but was also not good. There is a man named Harlan Breeze, he said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, his hat set on the table between them, something he never did except when he was being particularly serious. He came into town 3 days ago. He is a land agent, he says, working for a land acquisition company out of Denver. He has been making inquiries about this stretch of the valley. Inez felt the familiar cold clarity of potential threat. What kind of inquiries? The kind that suggests someone in Denver has decided this land is worth consolidating, Milton said. He was asking about the homesteaders in this stretch, how many of them, how long they had been on their properties, whether any of them were in arrears on their county land taxes. Inez's jaw tightened. Am I? Not according to what I could learn. But I do not know the full situation with the county records. He paused. There is something else. He was asking specifically about this property. Inez absorbed this. Why specifically this one? I do not know yet, but I intend to find out. He rode back to Montrose the next day and the day after that, spending time he framed as errands but which Inez knew was intelligence gathering of a very specific and deliberate kind, and on the third day he came back with more. Harlan Breeze, it turned out, was not entirely what his Denver business card described. He had a history in land acquisition that involved methods that did not bear close examination, methods that had resulted in more than one small homesteader losing their land under circumstances that appeared legal on the surface and were not legal underneath. He uses county records, Milton told her. He finds properties where the title documentation has any gap or ambiguity, and he uses those gaps to challenge the claim. Sometimes he manufactures the gaps. He looked at her steadily. I need to see your deed, Inez, and all the documentation that came with it. She got the papers. They spread them on the table and Milton went through them with a slow and careful attention that told her he had done this before, in some context, and she asked him about that. Cal Ferris's land trouble with Aldous, he said without looking up from the papers. I spent a good deal of time learning how the legal machinery of land claims worked, trying to help him. Most of what I learned turned out to be too late, but the learning stayed. He found 2 things. The first was a minor clerical inconsistency in the way the property boundary description was recorded, which was common and generally meaningless, but could be made into something in the hands of someone determined. The second was more significant. The deed had been originally registered in Robert Hadley's name only, which meant that the transfer of the property to Inez upon his death depended on a chain of probate documentation that she had, and she had done correctly, but which was recorded in a Missouri county court, not a Colorado territorial court, and the legal standing of that across territorial boundaries was the kind of question that an unscrupulous land agent could make expensive and complicated. "This is a solvable problem," Milton said, sitting back. "But it needs to be solved before Breeze makes his approach, because once he makes his approach the clock will be against us. What do we do?" "You write a letter tonight to the county seat in Gunnison, documenting the situation and your standing. I will write it there myself tomorrow. It is faster than post, and I will speak to the county recorder directly. I have some experience with making arguments to county officials." A slight pause. Some of it was successful. Inez looked at him. "You would ride to Gunnison in January?" "Yes," he said. "That is 2 days' ride in this weather." "Yes," he said again simply. She looked at him for a long moment. "Milton," she said, "this is your land," he said. "You worked for it. You came here alone and you have fought for it alone for a year. I am not going to sit in this house and watch someone take it from you because I am reluctant to ride in January." There was nothing in his voice that demanded recognition or credit for this. He said it the way he did everything, plainly and without theater, and this somehow made it more affecting than if he had said it with force. "Then I will write the letter," she said. She wrote it that night, carefully, with his help on the specific legal language. And in the morning he rode north with it in the inside pocket of his coat. And she stood on the porch in the cold, and watched him go and felt the fear and the loneliness of the empty property. And also, underneath them, something she recognized as the bedrock feeling of being genuinely not alone, of having someone in her corner who was in her corner not out of obligation or advantage, but out of something freely given. He was gone for 5 days because the weather turned on him on the second day, and he had to shelter in a farmhouse north of Cerro Summit for 2 days before the snow let up enough to push on. He came back with a letter from the Gunnison County Recorder and a certified document that established her claim unambiguously in Colorado territorial records, and a determination in his face that she was glad to see. "Breeze came by while you were gone," she said, when he had been inside long enough to thaw and drink the coffee she had ready. He put down his cup. "What happened?" "He knocked on the door," she said. "I did not open it. I told him through the door that my legal representation was occupied and would be in contact when convenient. I may have implied I had legal representation in Gunnison." The corner of his mouth moved. "Did you?" "I implied it," she said. "That was well done," he said. She set the certified document from Gunnison on the table between them. "This solves the problem." He looked at the document. "This makes the problem significantly harder for Breeze to exploit," he said. "He will likely decide this particular property is not worth the investment of his methods. There are other homesteaders in this stretch who are more vulnerable." This gave Inez pause. "There are other homesteaders in this stretch," she said. "Yes," he said. "3 that I know of. A family named Carver 12 miles east, a widower named Sampson 8 miles north, and a woman, I believe, another single homesteader further south. Do they know about Breeze?" Milton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They do not." Inez looked at him. He looked back at her. There was a conversation happening in that look that was not entirely about Harlan Breeze. "You are going to tell them," she said. "I think we should," he said. It was the "we" that she heard, not as an assumption, as a question asked carefully without pressure. "Yes," she said, "we should." Over the next 2 weeks, when the weather allowed, they made the rides to the other homesteads in the stretch of valley, and they told what they knew and they shared the documents and the legal approach. And in this way became, gradually and unofficially, a kind of connected community in a stretch of land that had existed in isolation before. Breeze made one more approach to the Hadley homestead in early February, this time appearing at the door properly, hat in hand, with the smooth professional confidence of a man who had never yet met a situation he could not reshape to his advantage. He was perhaps 45, broad-shouldered and well-dressed in a way that felt calculated, with a smile that did not go anywhere near his eyes. Inez opened the door and invited him in, which surprised him, and she sat him at the kitchen table and poured him coffee, which surprised him further. And Milton came in from the back door and sat at the other end of the table, and smiled at Breeze with the same patient gray eyes that had once looked calmly up at a raised cast iron skillet. And Inez set the certified Gunnison document and 2 other letters on the table. One from the Carvers and one from Sampson, both asking her to share their similar documentation in situations like this. And she watched the calculation run behind Breeze's eyes as he assessed what was in front of him. The document said, without saying it in words, that this homestead was legally solid, that the surrounding homesteaders were aware and connected, and had done their paperwork, and that the man sitting at the other end of the table was someone who understood exactly what Breeze was doing and had prepared against it with a thoroughness that made this particular stretch of Colorado Valley a poor return on the investment of Harlan Breeze's particular methods. Breeze drank his coffee. He made pleasant conversation about the weather and the price of cattle. He did not mention land acquisition once. He left after 30 minutes and rode north and did not come back. Inez locked the door behind him and turned to find Milton standing in the kitchen looking at her with an expression that was warm in the quiet, absolute way his warmth was always quiet and absolute. "You are remarkable," he said. "We are effective," she said. "There is a difference." He laughed then, a real laugh, which she had been working to earn since November, and it was worth every minute of the working. Spring came to the Colorado high country the way spring always comes there, reluctantly and then all at once, the snow drawing back up the ridges, the brown grass underneath it shaking itself loose, the creek that ran along the north side of the property running high and clear and cold with snowmelt. The cottonwoods along the creek came into their pale green, and the sage turned silver green on the slopes, and the world opened up again after the forced intimacy of winter, wider and more complicated. With the spring came questions that the winter had allowed them to defer. The most pressing was Milton's warrant. He had not forgotten it, and she had not forgotten it, and over the course of the winter it had acquired a weight that silence was no longer adequate to carry. In March, Milton rode to Montrose and sent a letter through the post to a contact he had in Kansas, a man who had once been a court clerk in Wichita, asking for whatever information was available on the status of the warrant. He came back and told Inez what he had done that evening, sitting in the chairs by the stove with the fire lower now because the evenings were warming. "What will we do if the warrant is still active?" she asked. The "we" again. He heard it. His face changed in the way it changed when the "we" happened, something settling in it, something deeply grateful and quietly fierce at once. "I will hire a lawyer in Denver and address it directly," he said. "It is an old warrant from a situation that was misrepresented in the record. I have documentation of my own. It would cost money and time, but it is addressable." He paused. "I cannot stay in one place permanently with a warrant outstanding. If I am going to stay," he said carefully, "I need to address it." Inez looked at him. "If you are going to stay," she repeated. He met her eyes. "If you want me to stay," he said, "that is the question that actually needs answering." She had been thinking about this all winter. She had thought about it while he was in Gunnison, alone in the cold house, and she had thought about it every morning watching him cook in her kitchen, and she had thought about it in the barn when he had set our boundary, and she had thought about it lying awake listening to the wind knowing he was on the other side of the wall. And she had built her way toward an answer with the same careful, deliberate work she built everything with. Because Inez Hadley did not make decisions of consequence without giving them the weight they deserved. "Yes," she said, "I want you to stay." He was very still for a moment. "Inez," he said. "I want you to stay," she said again. "And I want to be clear about what I mean by that." She turned to face him directly. "I have been married. I have some understanding of what it costs. I am not afraid of the cost. But I need a man who is my partner, not my protector, not my patron, and not my keeper. A man who is here because he has chosen to be here, not because he has nowhere else to be or because I need tending." "I am here because I have chosen to be here," he said without hesitation. "I know that," she said. "I am saying it anyway because I need it said." "I understand," he said. "And I am saying this. I would like to remain here on this land beside you, as whatever you are willing to have me be. I would like eventually, if you are ever willing, to ask you to marry me. But I will not ask that until the warrant is resolved and I am a man who can offer you a future without a legal complication buried in it." He paused. "And I will not ask it until you are ready to be asked." Inez looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very precise and considered statement," she said. "I have had several months to compose it," he said. She laughed. Then she crossed the distance between their chairs and sat on the arm of his, and he turned toward her and she put her arms around him, and he held her with the same quiet, absolute completeness with which he did everything, his face against her hair, and they sat like that as the fire burned lower and the spring night pressed gently against the windows. "Resolve the warrant," she said into his collar. "Then ask me." "Yes," he said. The letter from the Kansas contact came in April. The warrant was still technically on record, but had not been actively pursued in several years, which suggested a degree of administrative neglect that was common in post-territorial Kansas. The contact believed it could be addressed through proper legal channels at reasonable cost, though it would require Milton to be physically present in the relevant jurisdiction, which was Wichita, for a period of time to appear before the court. Milton told Inez this on a warm April evening with the kitchen window open and the smell of the newly woken earth coming through it. "How long?" she said. "He estimates 2 to 4 weeks, Milton said. "Travel there and back is another 2 weeks. 5 to 6 weeks total," optimistically. Inez was quiet. 5 to 6 weeks. She looked at her hands on the table. 6 weeks alone in the homestead was not the impossibility it would have been in January. It was spring. The land was manageable. She was capable. But she had grown, she admitted quietly to herself, accustomed to not being alone. And there was also the fact that a man riding to Kansas to deal with a warrant was a man riding toward uncertain outcomes. "What are the risks?" she said. "The lawyer believes they are manageable," Milton said. "The warrant is old. The main risk is that Aldous or his people still have enough local influence to complicate the hearing." "But Aldous died in 1881, according to what Cal told me in a letter last year, which removes that particular concern." He looked at her steadily. "I believe it will be all right. I intend to be careful." "You always intend to be careful," she said, "which is not the same as a guarantee." "No," he said, "it is not. Nothing is a guarantee." He leaned forward slightly. "But I am coming back, Inez. You should understand that as a fixed point. I am coming back to this land and to you." She looked at him. She believed him. Not naively, not without the counterweight of everything she had learned about promises in her life, but with the earned belief of a woman who had spent a winter watching a man reveal himself in small, constant ways that added up to character. "Then go," she said. "Go resolve it and come back." He left on a Thursday morning in late April, saddlebags packed with necessities and the legal papers and the journals she had given him at Christmas, which he had been filling steadily through the winter. He stood by his horse at the edge of the property, and he held her face in his hands, and he looked at her like someone memorizing something essential. 6 weeks at most, he said. "I will be here," she said. He kissed her once, with care and completeness, and then he mounted and rode north toward the pass, and she stood at the edge of her property and watched him go until she could not see him any more, and then she went inside and went to work. She was not idle during his absence. She planted the kitchen garden with the full investment of her attention and energy, worked the south field that she had been preparing to expand her grain production, struck up a more active correspondence with the Carver family and with the widower Sampson, who had a son of about 14 who came sometimes to help with heavier work in exchange for meals. She kept the homestead. She kept herself. But she watched the road north every morning, and she kept a private count of the days, and she let herself feel the absence of him without performing bravery about it, which was its own kind of bravery. Letters came from him on an irregular schedule dictated by the availability of post riders and the geography of his route. He wrote in the careful, deliberate way he did everything, Letters that were thorough and honest about the journey and the legal situation, and also, gradually, more open in their expression of the things he felt. Things he found it easier to write than to say, and which Inez read multiple times and kept in a cedar box on the shelf above her desk. In the third letter, sent from a small town south of Dodge City, he wrote, "I find myself counting the days in a way I have never counted anything. I have spent years of my life not caring much where I was or how long I stayed. I think that is over now. I think you have ended it, which I mean as the best possible thing." She read this sitting on the porch on a warm May morning with the creek running high and the new leaves of the cottonwoods bright as candle flames in the morning light, and she felt something in her chest open up completely, the last door she had been keeping shut, and she let it open and did not try to close it again. He came back on a Thursday evening in early June, 6 weeks and 2 days after he had left, riding in from the north in the long golden light of a summer evening, and she was in the kitchen garden when she heard Jasper's hooves on the hardpan, and she stood up and put her hand over her eyes against the light and watched him come down from the ridge. And she did not run because she was not a woman who ran, but she walked to the edge of the property as quickly as she could without it being running. He swung down from the saddle and he looked at her, and he looked sun-dark and tired and more himself than she had ever seen him look, which was saying something. "The warrant," she said. "Dismissed," he said, "formally and completely. There is a document," he patted his coat, "signed by a circuit court judge in Wichita. I am a free man in the state of Kansas for whatever that is worth." "It is worth quite a lot," she said. He was still holding Jasper's reins. He was looking at her with an expression that she knew was the most open expression his face was capable of, which was not dramatic in the way another man's openness might be dramatic, but which was, in its quiet absoluteness, more affecting than dramatic openness would have been. "Inez," he said. "Yes," she said. "I said I would ask you when the warrant was resolved." "You did," she said. "It is resolved," he said. "It is," she said. He stood with the reins in one hand and looked at her in the June evening light and said, without any preamble, without getting down on one knee because that was not how either of them did things, "I would like to marry you. I would like to be on this land with you for the rest of my life. I would like to build something here with you that neither of us could build alone. I love you, Inez," which I should probably have said before asking, but I wanted to say the full version of it while I was saying it. Inez looked at him. She thought about Missouri and Robert and the grief that had driven her west, and the year she had spent alone on this land, and the morning she had flung open the door with a skillet in her hand, and found him crouched on her porch step setting down a covered tin plate with such reverence that she had not been able to say what she wanted to say, which was why, without knowing it yet, she had not sent him away. "I love you too, Milton," she said. "And yes." He let out a breath that was longer and heavier than any breath she had heard from him before, a breath that had apparently been waiting for some time, and then he reached out and pulled her to him with one arm, and she pressed her face against the chest of his trail coat, and they stood there in the long June light with Jasper browsing the grass behind him, and the creek talking in the cottonwoods and the land all around them in the last of the day's gold, and it felt like the word home said in every direction at once. They were married in July, on a Saturday, in Montrose, in the small white-frame Methodist church at the south end of town, before a minister named Reverend Caleb Holt, who had been in Montrose since its founding, and who married couples with the brisk, affectionate efficiency of a man who loved his work. The Carvers came, all 5 of them, and Sampson came with his son, and 3 other families from the valley whose acquaintance they had made over the spring were there as well. And there was a reception of sorts in the churchyard afterward with food brought by everyone and a fiddle player who materialized as if by arrangement and was not entirely sober, but was extremely capable. Inez wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue cotton she had ordered from Montrose, a color she had chosen because it was close to the color of the sky over the valley at mid-morning, which was her favorite particular shade of blue in the world. She wore her dark hair pinned up with 2 pins that had belonged to her mother, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Milton had gathered himself from the slope above the property, and had presented to her that morning, with a formality that made her laugh and a vulnerability in his face that made her want to hold him. Milton wore his best coat, which she had not previously seen, a dark charcoal wool that fit him properly, and he had shaved that morning with the careful attention he gave to few things, and he stood beside her in front of Reverend Holt with his hands quiet at his sides, and he said the words of the marriage vows with the same quiet absolute weight with which he said everything, looking at her face and not away from it, and she said the same words to him and looked right back. When Reverend Holt said they were married, Milton kissed her, and the Carver children cheered, and someone fired a pistol into the air outside, which was technically prohibited in town limits, and no one seemed to mind. The summer that followed was the best summer of Inez's life, and she knew it while it was happening, which was rare. She knew it the way you know things that you have earned the right to know, clearly and without apology. They worked the land together, the expanded grain field and the kitchen garden and the new vegetable plot Milton had broken ground on along the south side of the house. They rode out together in the evenings when the day's work was done, along the creek and up into the high country above the valley, where the meadows opened up wide and gold, and the sky was so large and close you felt you could touch it if you reached. They talked, in the mornings over the breakfast that was now entirely collaborative, and in the evenings by the stove or on the porch, and sometimes late at night when neither of them could sleep, and they would sit up together and talk about things that mattered and things that did not matter, and the line between those categories was not always clear, and that was fine. Milton began writing in the journals she had given him. Not sporadically but regularly, every morning before breakfast, and she did not ask what he was writing and he did not volunteer it, but one evening in August he handed her the second journal and said she could read it if she wanted to, and she read it over the course of 2 evenings and found that it was exactly what she might have expected from him and exactly what surprised her, a careful and honest account of the years of his wandering life. Written with the eye of someone who had been thinking hard about what he had seen and what it meant, and interwoven with it, from the first entry, a thread that was about her, about the valley, about what he had found here that he had not been looking for. She gave it back to him and said, "You should send this to someone." He looked at her. "Send it to who?" "A newspaper," she said. "A magazine, someone who publishes writing of quality." He looked at the journal. He looked at her. "You think it is that?" he said. "I think it is considerably more than that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to be a teacher," he said, "not a writer." "They are not incompatible," she said. He thought about it for a long time, the way he thought about things, and in September he sent 3 pages to a magazine in Denver called The Frontier Record that published accounts of Western life, and in November a letter came back from the editor, saying they would be very glad to publish the piece and please send more. This arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Milton read it twice, and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it, while Inez stood at the stove finishing the coffee, and she heard his silence and turned and saw his face and crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him from behind and pressed her cheek against the back of his shoulder, and he put his hand over hers on the table, and they stayed like that for a moment in the warm kitchen, with the November light coming in pale through the window. "I was going to be a teacher in Kansas," he said quietly, "and I became a drifter in Colorado, and now I am apparently a writer." "You are many things," she said, "all of them the same person." The winter of 1884 into 1885 was milder than the previous one, or felt milder, and Inez understood that the difference was not meteorological. It was the difference between a winter endured and a winter inhabited, between surviving the cold and being warm enough inside it to find the beauty of it. In November, Inez told Milton that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning over the coffee that was always between them, because the kitchen was the heart of their life together, and had been since the first morning he had cooked in it, and the morning was the truest part of their day. He received the news with a stillness that held more than stillness usually holds. She watched him take it in, watched the adjustment happen in his face and behind his eyes, watched something shift in the way he held his shoulders, and then he stood up and came around the table and held her both arms properly with his face in her hair, and he did not say anything for a while because he did not have to. "Are you frightened?" she asked him eventually into his chest. "Yes," he said. "Are you?" "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "We are being honest." She laughed, which made him hold her more tightly. The pregnancy was not easy in the early months. She was more tired than she had expected to be, and there were mornings when the smell of breakfast cooking made her genuinely unwell, which was a significant irony given the history of the breakfasts between them. Milton adapted without complaint, quietly, moving the cooking outside on mild mornings or rearranging the kitchen routine, so that Inez came in after the initial cooking smells had cleared. He watched her with an attention that was not hovering, that had the same quality his silences had, present without pressure, and she found it steadying rather than smothering. By the new year she was feeling better and the baby was making itself known in the unmistakable ways of second trimester, and Milton would sometimes put his hand flat against her side in the evenings, with a wondering care that she found she had to look away from because it moved her more than she could easily hold in her face. He wrote during this time. He sent more pieces to the Frontier Record and they were all accepted, and the editor asked if he was working towards something longer. And Milton, after telling Inez about this and receiving from her the look that said, "Of course you are," began working on something longer, a book-length account of his years of traveling through the West, through territories both settled and wild, that was part memoir and part careful observation, and was, Inez thought, reading the pages as they accumulated. Exactly the kind of thing that a former teacher's apprentice with too much intelligence and not enough outlet had been building toward for years without knowing it. Their son was born in July of 1885. It was a long labor, long enough that Milton, who had remained outside the bedroom at the request of the attending woman who had come from Montrose to assist, wore a groove in the floorboards of the front room before the cry came through the wall that rearranged everything in him. Mrs. Carver, who had been the attending woman, opened the bedroom door and looked at him with a face full of the particular warmth that the birth of a healthy child produces in people who love the family it is born to, and she said, "A boy. They are both well." Milton stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at Inez, who was tired in the specific deep way of a woman, who has just done the hardest physical work her body is capable of, and she was holding the baby and looking down at him with an expression that he later tried to describe in his journal, and found that the language was insufficient, the way some things are insufficient to language, and had to settle for saying that it was the most complete expression of love he had ever seen on a human face. He came to the bed and sat beside her and looked at the baby, who was red and fierce and new, and he reached out and touched the back of the baby's fist with one finger, and the baby's fist closed around it with the absolute blind certainty of the newly born. "What should we call him?" Inez said. Milton thought about it. He thought about Kansas and Emery Bell and the years of the road, and the morning he had crouched on a porch step in the early Colorado dark setting down a covered tin plate with a care that he could not have fully explained even to himself at the time, but which had been the beginning of the best thing in his life. "Emery," he said. Inez looked at him. She knew the name from the stories he had told. She understood what it carried. "Emery Doyle," she said, and the name settled into the room and fit perfectly, the way right things fit. Emery Doyle proved from his first weeks to be a child of strong opinions and considerable lung capacity, which Inez observed was a combination she should have predicted given his parents. He grew with the hearty speed of a child raised on good food and clean air, and the homestead rearranged itself around him with a naturalness that both parents found something like miraculous. The way a life already full of meaning becomes more meaning, without losing any of what it was before. Milton's book was completed in the winter of 1885 and sent to a publisher in Denver in the spring of 1886. The editor at the Frontier Record had given him a contact there, a man named Whitfield who ran a small publishing operation that had put out several well-regarded accounts of Western life. Whitfield wrote back in the summer to say he would publish it, which Milton received with the careful, disbelieving quiet of a man who has wanted something for a long time and does not yet trust the wanting to be answered. Inez read the published book in January of 1887, when it arrived in 6 copies in a paper-wrapped parcel from Denver, which she unpacked at the kitchen table while Milton sat across from her with his coffee and pretended to be reading something else. She read it over 3 days in the evenings after Emery was asleep, and when she finished it, she closed it and sat with it in her lap for a moment before she looked up at Milton, who was sitting across the room with a studied casualness that fooled neither of them. "There is a chapter near the end," she said. "That is about a valley in Colorado and a woman on a piece of land alone." "Yes," he said. "You do not use my name." "No," he said. "I did not think I had the right without asking." She looked at the book in her lap. She looked at him. "You should have used my name," she said. "Next time." The relief in his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. The years that followed were full, the ordinary, extraordinary fullness of a life built with purpose and love in a piece of land that they continued to work and improve and make more theirs with each season. The south field expanded. The barn was enlarged. Jasper was joined by 2 more horses and a small milk cow, and a flock of chickens that Inez managed with an efficiency that suggested a natural talent for poultry that she had not previously known about herself. Emery grew from infancy into a sturdy, laughing toddler into a child with his father's gray eyes and his mother's absolute directness of expression, who followed both parents around the homestead with the determined attachment of a child who has decided that every adult process is worthy of close inspection. He developed an early passion for the horses, specifically for Jasper, who was patient with him in the way old animals are patient with very young ones, as if recognizing a similarity. In 1888, Inez was expecting again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, which she reported to Milton as evidence of her improving expertise, and he received this with the dry smile she had learned to love. Their second child, born in March of 1888, was a girl. They named her Clara after Inez's mother, which was a name she had been saving without telling Milton she was saving it. And when she said it, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Tell me about her." And Inez told him about her mother, the whole story, for the first time, and he listened with the absolute attention that was one of the best things about him. And Clara slept between them in the lamplight, while the early spring wind moved outside, and the story of Inez's mother took its proper place in the house. Milton's second book was begun in the fall of 1888 and finished in 1890, this one more explicitly about the land and the people who were working to make lives on it, and this one did use Inez's name with her permission, and was dedicated to her in a single line that read, "For Inez, who opened the door." She held the dedication page for a long time when the new copies arrived from Denver. She understood every layer of what it meant, the door of the homestead, the door of herself. The door of a future she had not believed in until someone had spent 31 mornings convincing her, through the simple, persistent language of warm food left with care, that she was worth the persistence. The Montrose community grew through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, and with its growth came a school. A proper one, funded by the county, with a hired teacher, and when the first teacher departed after 1 year, finding Colorado winters incompatible with his continued happiness, the school board sent notices throughout the valley looking for a replacement. Milton Doyle's name was submitted by 3 separate people, including Mrs. Carver, Sampson's son, who was by then a young man of some local standing, and the editor of the small Montrose newspaper who had been publishing Milton's occasional shorter pieces for 2 years. He came to Inez with the submission notice and set it on the kitchen table between them, in the spot where important documents between them always seemed to land. She looked at it. She looked at him. "A teacher in Colorado," she said. "A teacher in Colorado," he said. "The school is in Montrose," she said. "That is 18 miles. There is a room available above the printer," he said. "I would stay there through the school week and come home on Friday, or we could consider whether we wanted to be closer to town." Inez looked out the kitchen window at the land, the south field, the garden, the creek line and the cottonwoods and the ridge in the distance. "This is our land," she said. "Yes," he said. "You can ride 18 miles on Friday evenings," she said. "Easily," he said, and the word had a warmth in it that was about more than the ride. He got the position. He began teaching in September of 1891, and he was, as Inez had always known he would be, extraordinary at it, with the patient thoroughness of a man who had spent his youth wanting this and his adulthood preparing for it without knowing that was what he was doing. He came home on Friday evenings, and the children, Emery, who was now 6, and Clara, who was 3, learned the sound of Jasper's hooves on the approach to the property, and would run to the fence to wait for him. And Milton would swing down from the saddle and catch one in each arm and carry them both to the house, while Inez stood on the porch and watched and felt the full weight of her life, good and complex and hard one and real, and was grateful for every part of how she had gotten here. One evening in the fall of 1891, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, and the leaves of the cottonwoods along the creek were going gold in the early October way they had, Inez sat on the porch in the cool air and thought about the morning she had flung open the door with a cast iron skillet. She thought about the man she had found on the step, crouched and careful, holding a covered plate with both hands as if it were something precious, looking up at her without flinching. She thought about what she had felt in that moment, the rage and the fear and the hollow, desperate loneliness she had been converting to fury. And she thought about how wrong she had been to expect what she had expected, and how grateful she was that she had been wrong. She thought about the 31 mornings of covered plates, the careful, invisible persistence of it, a person deciding that she needed something and providing it without asking for recognition or gratitude or even acknowledgement, simply because it was the right thing and because she needed it. She had experienced that as a threat because she had been a woman alone in an isolated place in 1883, and she had learned from bitter necessary experience that gifts from strangers in the West were rarely free. But this one had been. This one, as improbable as the fact was, had actually been. The door opened behind her. She did not turn. She heard him settle into the other porch chair, heard the quiet sound of him setting his coffee cup on the porch rail. "The cottonwoods are going," he said. "Yes," she said. "They do this every year, and every year it is new." A companionable silence, the creek in the background, the October stars beginning to show in the deep blue overhead. "I have been thinking," he said, "about a third book." "What about?" she said. "About teaching," he said. "About what education can mean in a place like this. About what it costs to have it and what it costs to not have it." He paused. "About a boy in Kansas with a teacher named Emery Bell who made him believe that thinking about the world was worthwhile." "That is the right book," she said. "It might take several years," he said. "It is more complicated than the others." "Most worthwhile things are," she said. She reached across the space between their chairs and set her hand on his, the way she had reached across the kitchen table toward him 8 years ago in the lamplight, and changed the direction of both their lives. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, and they sat together on the porch of the homestead in the October evening. The house warm behind them with the sleeping children, and the lamp in the kitchen window that burned every night like a fixed point, like a place that would always be there. Inez Hadley, who was now Inez Doyle, looked out at the land she had come to alone in her grief and her stubborn surviving will, and she thought about what it meant to have built something real from the wreckage of something that had not been what it appeared to be. She thought about the 40 acres and the stone house and the south field and the creek and the ridge and the journals and the books and the 2 sleeping children and the man beside her with his warm hand around hers. She thought about 31 mornings. She thought about the courage it takes to offer something with no expectation of return, to leave warmth for a stranger on a cold porch without asking to be seen, to keep returning day after day in the face of silence, because you believed the silence was not refusal but armor, and armor could be patiently waited out. She thought about the courage it takes to finally open the door. In the spring of 1892, Inez told Milton she was expecting again, and he received this news in the kitchen over the morning coffee, the same way he received everything important in their life, with a stillness that held gratitude and wonder and the specific tenderness of a man who had spent enough years without home to know precisely what having one was worth. Their 3rd child, a boy, was born in November of 1892. They named him William, after Milton's father, because Milton was a man who could hold his complicated history with the people who had shaped him and honor them without being defined by the distance he had traveled from them. William arrived in the world with his mother's dark eyes and his father's absolute calm and the specific healthy ferocity of a 3rd child who has come into a house already full of love and simply extends its borders. Emery, who was 7, received his new brother with the thoughtful seriousness of a child who understood that important things required appropriate attention. Clara, who was 4 and had been the youngest for all of her remembered life, regarded William with a brief philosophical skepticism before deciding he was acceptable and assuming an elder sibling authority that she would maintain with complete conviction for the rest of her childhood. Milton came home from Montrose on the Friday after William's birth to find all 3 children, Inez and Mrs. Carver, in the kitchen, and he stood in the doorway for a moment taking in the full noise and warmth and beautiful ordinary chaos of it, and then he put down his bag and came into the room and was home. The homestead in the valley, which Inez had come to in grief and solitude in the autumn of 1883 with a deed and a mule and a hollow where the future was supposed to be, became over the years one of those places that accumulates meaning the way good land accumulates soil, slowly and continuously, and through the work of patient hands. The stone house was added to, a bedroom for the children, and then a proper study for Milton's writing, and eventually a larger kitchen because Inez, who had become the kind of cook that proximity to a man who cooked with love will make of a person, needed the space. The barn expanded. The fences held. The south field produced year after year with the steady faithfulness of well-tended ground. Milton's 3rd book was finished in 1895 and published in 1896, and it was the one that was read most widely, that found its way into the hands of educators across the country, and was referenced in discussions of frontier education for years afterward. And Inez read it the same way she had read the others, in the evenings when the house was quiet, and she felt the same thing she had always felt reading his work. The particular pride of someone who knows the full person behind the words and finds the words worthy of them. He continued to teach in Montrose and continued to ride home on Friday evenings and continued, through all the years, to cook breakfast on Saturday and Sunday mornings. And there was something in the persistence of this, the same warm care that had begun on her porch step, that Inez found she could not quite describe to anyone who had not lived it, but that was the purest expression she knew of what it meant to be loved by Milton Doyle. Not the grand gesture, not the dramatic sacrifice. The small, consistent offering of warmth, day after day, regardless of whether it was received with open arms or a raised skillet, because the offering was not contingent on the reception. It was simply what you did when you loved someone and they needed something, and you had it to give. The October morning that Inez sometimes thought of as the true beginning of their life together was the morning she had finally opened the door and found him there. But looking back from the years of the life they had built, She understood that he had opened a door too that morning, a different one he had been approaching with the same careful patience he brought to every threshold, and that they had come through it together, which was the only way that mattered. The Colorado Valley held them. The cottonwoods went gold every fall and silver every winter and green every spring. The creek ran. The ridge stood. The south field grew. The children grew. The books accumulated on the shelf that Milton had built along the east wall of the study, his own books among them and the books they had gathered together over the years, and the ledger from 1883 that Inez kept not because it was useful, but because it was the ledger she had been working through on the night she had unchained the door and let a quiet man in from the cold. Sometimes on autumn evenings when the children were grown and the house was quieter, and the two of them sat on the porch the way they always had, with the coffee and the stars and the creek in the background, Inez would think about 31 mornings of warm food on a cold porch step. And she would think about all the things she almost had not let herself have. And she would feel the weight of the life she had chosen and had been given and had fought for and had built. And she would reach across the space between their chairs, as she always did, and he would reach back as he always did, and they would sit together in the last light over the valley, and the word home would say itself in every direction, quiet and vast and absolutely certain.